So because we did have such rich and articulate presentations, I thought that it's probably the best strategy in this presentation to perhaps push a few questions a little bit further. And James, I'm going to start with you because one of the things that I was really interested in your presentation, and it was very fundamental to me, that you talked about the importance of making and fabrication, and I've sort of always sensed that in your work it's almost palpable that extrusion of the physicality and the making and the materiality is always present. And over time, through access to certain technologies and different production methods, you have been able to expand your material access. But you did say in your talk something to the extent of that you were perhaps trying to push back a little bit on that. And I guess I'm interested in you talking a bit more about that and perhaps at what point you feel you are in terms of your practice. It's it's something I've been thinking about for a while. I guess the thing is, like, as an artist, you kind of, in a way to kind of generate new ideas, you kind of want to make... Can everyone hear me? You want to kind of make life difficult for yourself a little bit, and to sort of throw spanners into the works and try and disrupt the sort of routines that you follow and the ways that you think about what you do. And I had just found that I was sort of relying on this kind of fairly sort of binary relationship between what I was trying to think of in my head and the way that it was being produced a little too much, and that at the same time I was sort of, what had once been an exciting field to work in with sort of like machining and technology, which was mostly used, when I started using it at least, in product design and medicine, has now become this kind of meme, and it's kind of like you can buy 3D printers at the hardware store and so on. And my question kind of is really like, to what end? Because it's fine to have a means to make something, but what do you make with it? And it seems that it's almost making like... there is a fear that it could be making sort of production almost, or design rather, almost this kind of tailorist thing or something. It sort of becomes overly efficient and easy. So I'm trying to just figure out ways to weed those steps out of the way that I think about how things are made. Certainly the last project I made could have really been designed on a pencil and paper. And I'm now starting to look at ways where it's a genuinely kind of analog process from start to finish. It's hard to discuss what those objects are going to be because they're still being kind of made, But I can say, for example, that in my studio, for the first time, I've been making objects and destroying them. And that's something I've never really ever done. It's always been from the head into the sort of machine and out the door. So that's about all I can give away at the moment. Stay tuned. Unless my career completely collapses, in which case, you might be waiting a while. Perhaps Lisa, just maybe on that, because, it's interesting for you having gone from predominantly, well, you still work, but predominantly working in a material like bronze, and then suddenly you find yourself doing inflatables, and I've been the queen of inflatables, bringing a lot of artists with inflatables here, and had my own moment of failure as well, so that's right.
But not an empty scrotum, though.
No.
That's good.
But what, how's that transformation been for you? Because obviously you then find yourself having to work with a lot of different teams, a lot of different expertise, engineers and so on. And how would you see that as impacting on your thinking and the way you work?
Well, in the design process, it's hard because I am working with Felipe, and it's not my direct translation. I'm used to being quite hands-on with the designing. So what I have been doing is creating a hand model to start with, and then I give it to him and he scans that, and then he adds his stuff, because then there's all this technical stuff you need to do to make that inflatable work. The fingers have to be thicker and those sort of things, which he knows about. I enjoy working with other people, and I think always through my processes I have worked with other people, because I'll have a show maybe with some bronzes that are all hand sort of sculpted, and I'll mix that up with a video work that I've worked with 3 cameras to work on. So I have always meandered in and out. And with those sculptural works, like the big bronze bust, I worked with scientists for that, taxidermists, and then the face was digitally 3D scanned, so I then worked production and then incorporated it back into this handmade model. So it's something in between what you're talking about. And I think it's a really interesting thing, talking about, what James was saying about these new, techniques for sculpting or creating public works or even any artwork, is that how do you use them? And it was always the question. But I remember actually when I was living in Europe going to Cologne Art Fair one year, and it was probably about 1995, I think, and someone had got their hands on a medical scanner. And they'd taken photos of this artist had taken photos of his family and got it scanned. So there were these miniature scans. And there was a queue of about 50 people deep wanting to look at these scans, and they were charging 30,000 euros a work for these things that you can now just print at home. Mm. So it was technology, you've got to take it somewhere, and you've got to have a rationale and conceptual rationale about why you want to use it. And that's where it's still exciting.
And perhaps, Ian, just because you have predominantly worked with quite large teams, most of your production so far, and I guess it's that, how do you hold on to the integrity of your idea and find the artist in all of it? How do you keep control of that?
I think I always think about 2 things. So in the studio I have absolute control, and I love that. So if I want to make a drawing or a painting, I have that agency in the studio and it comes out exactly how I want it to come out. And I think when I start working in public and with teams, it's collaborative from the beginning. So I think the really... and that works. That's like doing big installations as well as doing works with houses or in public or in film or in photography as well. There's lots of things you can't control. So I think at a certain point, it actually, when things go wrong or people bring better ideas to the table who are on a team, then I always feel like the best idea in the room is still the best idea in the room, no matter who has it. It's not about your ego. It's about if people get it and everyone's pointed in the same direction, then ideas will flow and you'll get a better product. And particularly when things go wrong, you sometimes get really smart solutions on location as well. And it makes you tests the rigor of the idea, because if you understand the idea at its core, then you can understand how it can change and adapt. And so I think it's sort of really nice to be able to jump between the control of the studio and the chaos of collaboration and public. But I guess the answer is you don't have control. You can kind of push it in a direction, but sometimes something will want to go in a different way, and you have to be open to going with that and be surrounded by really smart people. Like, I'm really indebted to my teams and people who work with me and collaborate with me.
I want to ask James a question, because this sort of comes back to what you said about, and I really related to it, so I thought I was the only one that was lazy, but what you said about all artists want to actually have other people make decisions, and I thought that was really interesting, because I have that as well. I know this desire just for someone else to make a decision.
Probably not all artists. Well, I mean, it's just like a strategy. It's, in some ways, it comes out of appropriation, really, and it's sort of taking, for me at least, it's about taking existing systems in the world which are meaningful and kind of applying them to your to a gap or a hole in the way that you're sort of trying to put something together, I guess. So there's a laziness to it, but there is a beauty, I think, also in that mechanism when the default fits into what it fits or solves the problem that you're trying to solve, I guess, And
probably adds more to it in the process.
Yes, and there's a pleasure in sort of looking for it and thinking about it, conceiving of what the answer might be, and obviously it takes you outside of the studio, for me. So, but it's so. It is kind of a laziness. I think some artists are lazier than others, and much better at using that strategy. Also, it's a case-by-case thing, I guess, obviously.
I'm going to shift the conversation slightly because we've got James in town, and obviously he does have a large-scale public work in Forest Place. And I was interested that you were very forgiving about how that might be presented with the potty loos or toilet loos or whatever under the sculpture, or wedged in, so engineered so beautifully to fit the circumstance. But, in a forum like this where we're sort of talking about public art, I can't help but use the opportunity to say what I think it's a travesty, Forest Place, actually, in the sense that, you had a government and a city council come together for once with a substantial budget, I mean, still not a massive budget, but a substantial budget to commission a work. And I was a part of that decision-making. And the commitment to have James's work in Forest Place, and this had just happened after the Epper Hine Commission, and every time I go there now, it's filled with clutter, and I think one of the travesties of it happens in many cities, but perhaps more so in Perth, we have this desire to fill space with art instead of create space for art. And when I say art, I use that very advisedly. I mean, if you walk through Forest Place most of the time, there's, a multitude of temporary marquees or tents or something. There's layer upon layer of seating and activity, and there's, that's the other buzzword, I think, talking about clients and so on, but activation in the name of art, but actually the artists aren't present, or the art is the last thing that's thought of. So whilst I'm impressed by you being very accommodating, I think it's something that perhaps we all reflect on, that, Forest Place, I mean, cities all over the world have squares. When you talked about Beijing, and if you look in Europe, open squares, open space is such a privilege, and having one beautiful object or one experiential artwork or something, and we have this tendency to kind of clutter and kill the art. So it just seemed to be the forum to say that today. So as much as I admire your appreciation, I think it's unfortunately disrespectful. Moving on. Ian, I was going to ask you about, and perhaps this is something that all of you have said at some point, that notion of being invited into a space. And you talked about Christchurch. And I'm sort of wondering how that came about, because I think, there's no doubt all of these artists that we're listening to this morning have had a lot of vigour with their own careers, and they've kept delivering. And so the power of pedigree leads to opportunity. And, I talked before about the power of opportunity. So I'm interested in how that came about, and, who invited you, and where they'd sort of come in contact with what you'd been doing. Because obviously it was a very emotional moment for Christchurch.
Yeah, so that was a curator called George Shaw who saw the work on Cockatoo Island in 2011, and then contacted me again in 2013 and said, look, I know you're interested in houses. I think this might be this might be something. I didn't genuinely believe it was going to happen. I get approached by a lot of people for projects, and he sort of, at that stage, it was so early in my career, it seemed so big that I didn't think it would actually happen. And then he came to the NGV exhibition, and saw that, and then I think that's when he was like, okay, let's get you on a plane and get you to Christchurch and see what we can do there. And I think he sort of gained a lot of momentum for there. And I think he saw the potential of creating something that, for a festival, could have a level of spectacle that would then retell Christchurch's story internationally, because I think 3 years on it has sort of been forgotten as well. And I think I think his agenda was creating something for the city, to talk back in the city, but again, something that would also transmit that story again as well, and find other ways of finding an inroad for a city to tell the story about itself, but also to be able to translate internationally.
And the opportunity to work with such a prestigious filmmaker or cinematographer, was that something you were able to negotiate, or?
No, that was the curator who just met him at a pub. And he's told him about me and said, when I went on the scout trip, they just brokered an introduction, and we got along really well. And he we had very, very small budget, and he worked for free. He just liked the project and came on board.
Yeah.
And so we paid for his accommodation and his trip down, and he spent 2 weeks working on it with us, I think, which is incredible.
There's actually a slightly longer version of the little clip you showed on Christchurch, and the cinematographer does speak about the impact that project had on him, actually, and just the sort of working there all night and waiting for that moment of light. And I thought it was a really quite a powerful observation, that what he'd taken from you and your team.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's like layers of the work where there's the moment making the work and the process of making the work, but involving the community and making it, which in its way is it's kind of work in itself.
The was doing it, of course, actually, they're kind of like way ahead of us all the time. Do it.
Yeah.
Yep. I'm tempted to open it up. I've asked a few questions. We've got someone over there already. We've got a second mic, I think. Have we? Oh, okay. Sorry. So.
Yes, Margaret, can I just pursue your question to Ian just now about being invited? And Lisa, you were talking about Swire Group, and I suspect there's a huge story behind all that. Yeah. What's the take-home message for?
Don't take any of these projects on lightly because it's a big deal. What I recognise, I really wanted to produce a big project for the Year of the Monkey. It was about 4 years beforehand. I knew I needed time to develop that project. And the biggest challenge you need for a work that, this wasn't a permanent work, it wasn't going to be a work that needed a big budget, but it needed a building, and it was in China. It's difficult to get visas, to get the permits, all that sort of stuff. I was at the opposite house, the place where it was placed, which is owned by the Swire, and I actually met someone from the Swire building, and I just threw this idea at him, and he said, "That sounds unreal, why don't you do it here?" And so I just kept pursuing it and kept pushing it, and I was like a dog with a bone, and then eventually they just gave in, and I got the funding together after it was very hard to get it all together, to be honest. It was really like pulling teeth, what's the expression? Teeth out of hens. But it was a great partnership, and it was one that I would pursue again, because the things that they had to bring to the table were the things that I was weak in. They've got a huge PR unit, they had the building, they've got great facilities, they had an engineer team, and that's what they provided for that project. So it was ensured to succeed. They also have the connection with the Chinese government. So I had to deal with it to a degree, but not to the degree that can be really frightening. So it really was a great collaboration on that level.
Yes.
Can I just ask a question really directed at all three artists? A lot of the discussion this morning has been practically about process. How you go about doing these things when you're working with a team or a group of people and realising the work in a public setting. Very little discussion has been about the feedback you've had from the audience or how you understand. Some of that feedback is going to be direct. You're going to encounter someone who's going to tell you something. And hopefully you can speak about those kinds of interactions that be incredibly positive. Some of the audience responses can be something you never hear about, or you only hear about second or third hand. And so I wondered whether you could speak a bit about the audience for these works and some of that feedback that you've had. And indeed how you think about it, because it's not just making the object, working in the studio, getting permission, all of those logistical issues. Something happens whether it leaves the studio, whether the studio is the street and you're working on a building or something else, when you encounter a public.
And just for our recording purposes, sorry, John, because you've got a very strong voice, but just in case anyone hasn't heard, the question is largely about the emphasis and focus in the conversations this morning about artistic process and how they've gone about their projects. And I guess John is interested in hearing more about the impact on audience feedback, critical review, and so on. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I can cut across here because there's one of the things I talked about this morning, and I was taken by Lisa and the idea that you can't control the meaning. And I talked about that column that kept going into the ground and people signed their name on it because they were against fascism. Guess what? Fascism hasn't gone away in Hamburg. And as that object went down, there's whole 2-meter chunks that are about, let's not let any more Turks in. And then there's a 4-meter chunk that's about another population group. So that the artist couldn't control. And the lowerings were done as little civic ceremonies as they took it down a couple of meters. And by the end of the last 2 lowerings, there were sharpshooters on the roof of every building in the square. They were told not to be in groups of more than 2. You can't. It was an idealistic idea to do this, but the meaning of that object as it went down, it was well out of their control.
So thank you. That's actually very revealing in the context. But sorry the interruptions, but for the recording. So I'll hand it over to the panel, perhaps to respond to John's question, whoever'd like.
Okay. I think for me, there's different layers of audience in my work. So there's the community that the work's made in, and then there's obviously the documentation that's then presented in a gallery. So, I work really hard with communities to make sure that there's a positive impact in there, but, obviously we're quite invasive. So I've had works where I haven't made them in communities because we've had such a pushback to being in there. And so a lot of that work is done ahead of time, and it's done without me. So it's I've got an incredible producer, Jetta Andrews, who works on all my projects, and she will go in with teams and make sure that we're going to be welcomed into communities. And I've had houses and situations and projects that have just never gotten up just because the sense was the timing's not right. We're not going to be welcomed in these communities, and the last thing we'll do is turn up and force this onto people. But I think you're completely right. I think that you don't hear a lot of the negative feedback. I've got very, very good friends. Oh, and positive, yeah. No, but it's true. You can't, I mean, people, you kind of can live in a bubble as an artist as well, where you only hear praise and that's about it. And so I've got very good, honest friends around me and great peer group who are very, very happy to tear me down, which is very healthy. And it makes you better as well. And I think that there's that aspect to it. I mean, I guess at a community level, we've mostly had positive feedback. I haven't had too much pushback. When we have had pushback, we've recoiled or adapted a project or just not done it. Of course.
Or should we hear from the others first? Yeah, just to respond to the question. And then.
That's a great point to raise, and I think perhaps the answer lies in the fact that a lot of us perhaps didn't talk about it a lot because we often don't get feedback, and there's not really a mechanism to provide that. But there's kind of a mechanism. There's the press, so there's that side of feedback. And I don't participate in social media, so I couldn't really know what's going on in there at any given time. Do snoop around a little bit occasionally, I guess. But so for me, I guess, apart from reading the newspaper clippings that people who live with the sculptures send to me from wherever they happen to be, and there's really not that many, and they've been mixed, it's fair to say, in my case. The feedback for me really is revisiting the sites in real time after a duration and sort of just observing people, and that often for me is typically rewarding. I think you see people like there's things in sort of cities called desire lines where people track in particular directions and leave grooves in sort of grassland and so on. So it's interesting to watch the desire lines of people around these objects, and because it's all speculative, right? All of these projects are speculative. Like we don't know what's going to happen really. You can guess, but there are all sorts of things can kind of happen. And generally, I've been sort of, I don't know, pretty happy to kind of watch people doing what they're supposed to be doing with these things, and noting damage and stuff, and the odd bit of vandalism. And I think that's, you know, I don't want to like be overly generous about the way that my artworks are preserved or interfered with, but a little bit of vandalism is okay, you know, I guess. People have a right to express themselves.
It is the public realm.
It is, exactly.
Yeah.
It is very much the public realm, and
Yeah.
I've always tried to kind of think that, you know. When I was sort of, you know, looking, I kind of collect the writings of artists and sculptors mostly and read them, not a lot, but from time to time. And one of the reasons I kind of wanted to use Henry Moore's work as a kind of a foil for the artwork in Forest Chase was that he has quite explicitly stated that he's wanted artworks to be against a neutral backdrop, and to, except if it's in the Yorkshire Dale or something like that, you know. And so I really wanted to do the exact opposite of that and have the artwork really kind of bear the brunt of all of that stuff, and not kind of bandage it too much. But I think.
Hi, how are you? Different projects, you have different reactions. I mean, I suppose the worst reaction is when you get no reaction. And that's always, you know, a bit of a sinking moment. If you have a show and there's not even people criticising it. But with the Chinese project, the way of gauging it was very much, the social media was a very big platform for that work. And there was a lot of presence on that. And so there were actually quite quantifiable ways of gauging the interaction with the work from that platform. And then often a lot of comments were left. So I also gauged from my funding bodies, who I should say are AsiaLink, Creative Victoria, Australia-China Council, the Australian Embassy. A lot of these bodies came on board at the last minute, not Creative Victoria actually, they were great. But the other ones came on really only after they saw what that project was actually going to be. So I did a lot of the hard work, and in the end, they have said it's their most successful DFAT project, cultural project that they've had in Asia, and they have asked me to do this other project to accommodate the success of it. So there have been, for me, it was very rewarding on that level, that there was a lot of, it was quite quantifiable, the success of it. But for me, I love the fact of being able to get this large work up on this beautiful building, and, you know, so that was my gauge of success, and it didn't fly away and kill anyone, which was great. And yeah, you know, I did go to hospital one day out of stress, but that was about it.
But it's interesting.
So I lived.
You're here to tell the tale, that's right. Yeah. But it was interesting what you're talking about with the zoo, and, you know, this perceived resistance to putting a sculptural, you know, replica of, obviously not a replica of an animal, but, you know, a part of an animal into a sculptural bronze position in a zoo, and then there's saying the fear factor of children being scared by it and the irony of that. But then, as you said, you know, it's been publicly appreciated and loved by kids. And,
yeah,
you know.
look, it was so strong, the message from that whole thing. It was 5 years of me to persuade them. It was really a lot of work. I really wanted it in there. I mean, I'm still going to try and persuade them to get one actually in the enclosure, so that the apes can climb on one while the children are climbing on one, or whoever wants to climb on it. But you know, it's just this mentality. I just don't understand it, why people, I don't know, you know, it happens not just in Australia, but it is, Australians are very conservative, and the councils that are choosing, or whoever's choosing these works, are fearful of rippling, you know, rippling the surface of something. I don't know what it is. So we've got to break out of that. Whether it's with an ape finger sticking out of the ground, or, you know, whatever it is, it just needs to be something other than just choosing something because everyone likes it and it's not going to create a problem.
Oh, and there's certainly that. Andrew, I might come back to you because I know you want to make a comment in relation to this. Yeah.
I wanted to ask Ian, like whether you would work in any context if it was just to do with houses, because gave the example and you said about the wallpaper that somebody, the locals, are so concerned, you know, and everybody here laughed. And yet, this is a kind of post-Soviet country, and I've spent time living in a post-Soviet country in the last couple of years. And the concern that they expressed and that everybody laughed about was actually a very real community concern about their budgets, how their money is being spent. And to wallpaper, you know, an entire house is actually quite a serious thing. Not, you know, artistically, it's maybe a very interesting and exciting idea to put in a photograph and to later show it in an art gallery in non-Soviet countries. It's just a question, and I guess for me it raises the question, are there moral questions to do with practice? Is that not a thing to talk about? I don't know.
Has everyone heard that? Yeah? Okay.
No, I completely agree. I think that's there are huge ethical dilemmas, and there's a huge grey area of working in public as an artist as well. And I think there's questions about when you take that work made in a community and you take that to the market, and that's sold as a commodity. And am I profiting from this? And what's my role as a legacy? I don't see myself as a social practitioner. I'm not someone. I got good friends who have really strong social practice, and they commit to a community over decades, and they build in a community and they have long-term legacy. That's not the kind of artist I am. I work with groups and organisations that have links in communities that will go on. So the way that I work is I come in as a part of an ongoing conversation in a city. So the way that project came about, that was through I'm going to get this wrong. There's European Cultural Cities Initiative, and so that city had that funding for, I think it was 3 years, to set this up. And there is a real contradiction of all this money being spent on these art projects, and could that be spent better in a neighbourhood? And is a community like that, who is suffering from the closure of all these mines, are they really going to be enriched by a completely wallpapered building, or are they going to understand that? I mean, the work was not made to be photographed necessarily for exhibition, but it was made to sit in a community over a year and to actually be a part of a dialogue with the city, with a local curator, working with the local historical museum, picking that wallpaper so it spoke to that community. And so it does have, it was designed, but then, I mean, at a certain point, like, what weight can you put onto public art to solve all problems in a community as well? And I think it's absolutely something I think about. But again, that's the grey of leaving the studio as well and working in those public spaces. Yeah, I mean, I'm a privileged white kid from Western Australia making work in predominantly black Detroit. What does that mean? But if I'm working with the community organisations there and progressing their agenda as well as making my work, then I can sit at ease with that, and I feel comfortable with that. But I draw those lines, and there's other artists, and I've got friends who aren't comfortable where I draw the line, and they draw the line far further and talk about having a long-term engagement in a community and have a really progressive social practice. So it's a really, really good question, but I don't think there's a hard answer.
Thank you. And there's someone...
I just want to continue that idea when you talk about community, and we all talk about community. A lot of your work is about very individual places. You gave the example of your own home and recreating that and that sort of thing. So those houses that you worked on, individual families lived in. So, you know, there's a community spirit and a community consultation and all those kinds of things. But what about the individual families that actually lived, individual people who lived in those houses? Yep. What kind of connection did you have with them? What was their response? You know, what role did they play all through the project?
Well, the answer to the question is we work in Christchurch. The families haven't been in there for 3 years. So we researched the families through the organisations that were there. The families that were there in Christchurch were predominantly families who were spent 3 or 4 or 5 years because it was public housing, so it wasn't there was one family through there. We connected with people who had worked in the areas who actually came and watched it being filmed as well. And so those relationships, but that's for me, at that point, that's not work. That's part of the process of making the work. So there's no... I think what would be worse is going in there and drawing out. I'm not a journalist. I'm not there to make a documentary. I'm not there to tell stories of those people. I'll engage with communities and with local community organisations to make that work as well, to feel like it's sitting in a comfortable space for the work to be made within that organisation. But also, I'm not going in there to exploit people's stories as my work as well. And I think there's a line that I'm still finding. And I mean, I think I was quite open with that as well. It's something that I'm still working out and figuring out. I think there's ambiguity there. But ambiguity I'd like to be completely candid about as well.
Does anyone else want to make a comment on that area? No? Any other questions up there at the moment? Yes.
Hi. I've just got a question about your insight, general insight into your daily habits as artists. Because getting to this point in the trajectory of your career, do you find that sometimes you're not so much an artist, you're an artist, you work in art admin or something? Because my experience, I'm sure we can all agree, there's probably a stereotype of artists being not so great at filling out forms, or reading or paying attention, because we're, sort of thinking about other things like practice of sort. Like, how much do you find you actually have to be more conscious about, your practice rather than spending the whole day, working on emails and, waffling about, concepts and all that kind of stuff. Like sorry. But like, as in more like applying things.
I know exactly what you're saying. Like, I think I always joke I wish I could exhibit my emails because that's what I produce. So I produce emails and then occasionally make work. And I think that's, it's the more you go along, the more you're dealing with the bureaucracy of making. And it's a creative process, but it's not a fun creative process, I think.
I'm a bit confused by what the question is.
So I was just wondering, like a day-to-day, would you find yourself just spending more and more time, working in administration than actually working on your practice?
For me, every day is different, really. I try and build in, schedules according to what needs to get done, and sort of just because you have to deal with everyday life that way, basically. But, I think probably, like most artists, you just kind of deal with what you have to deal with, and sometimes that just involves daydreaming, and sometimes there's a lot of sort of correspondence, and sometimes you're covered in dust, and it's very flexible for me.
I suppose, James, a lot of your public work has been fairly linked to sort of architectural public art, hasn't it? I mean, not exclusively, obviously, but I mean, not that would diminish that admin role, but far from it, but at least it's probably slightly more contained than someone like Ian going into an entire new community and working with, 5 services and so on. So, I mean, I'm not saying there's anything diminished or value add, but it's just your experience seems to have been slightly different in terms of your studio practice sort of going out into the public practice, being still fairly linked to sort of architectural built form in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly different kind of burdens on our time,
And different client relationships. But.
Yeah, and, I guess, meetings are hard, really, to participate in and make effective, really hard. And they don't teach you that at art school, so you kind of gain skills, I guess, hopefully, in the types of meetings that you have to attend. Do you want to talk about that a bit more?
Same thing. I totally understand what you're saying. I reckon my routine now is about 90% of doing bureaucratic stuff. Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's soul destroying, to be honest. And that's getting the funding together. Your images, going to meetings, doing all the things you have to do to keep all these projects going. and then, when I first started, I'd go for 10 days without seeing anyone and just work in my studio and, be immersed in it and come out insane. And, but now it's, it's not like that. And I don't know many artists who do work. You might have to go and live a long way away from a centre like you, Abdul, and to actually sort of focus on your work just to... You do, yeah. It's hard to escape it. It's the advent of the internet. It's, this globalisation of art practice now. Our worlds are expanded, but with that comes this stuff. And also I think the role of the gallerist has changed really dramatically too. So where a gallerist used to take control of your slides, your CV, all that sort of stuff, they don't do that really anymore. And if they do it for you, you've got to sell your soul to them and, that's it. So, yeah.
I think it's an interesting point to talk about because it sort of comes back a little bit to what Andrew was saying too, that the practice of art now is a part of a whole global instrumentality. I mean, it's not devoid of all other systems that, have made the world change so dramatically in the last 20 years. I mean, social media is only one of them. But, that we have to sort of accept that I think we're all working and living in a very different time than we were even 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And the demands, I think, are not just on artists. I think they're on all of us in some ways. So I think finding that balance and that equilibrium of, what matters and what actually drives you and what your vision is and what your focus is has become a kind of challenge for everyone. It's sort of not the exclusive domain of artists, but nonetheless, it worries me if there's so much sort of external pressure and expectation and over-management that you can lose sight of, the passion and what drives and what the actual art is all about. I mean, God forbid that would happen. But is there any other questions or observations? Digby.
Thank you, Margaret. I'd just like to pick up on that globalisation idea a little bit. Lisa, when you spoke, you mentioned that in China, you sort of had thousands of people physically view the work, and millions see it, in a sense, sort of online or in different ways virtually. So the audience, the global audience, really is experiencing that work. At the end, a lot of your work is through film and photography, so it's not a direct experience of the actual object itself, although you do that as well. But do you think about how you engage with that sort of global audience? Does that have any impact on your making or how you present your work?
Yeah, it's interesting that I was in a show a few years back in Europe that was a group of Australian artists, and there was one particular piece that really wasn't very successful by this artist, but this person made sure that it had an incredibly great photographic documentation made from it. And those photos went all over Australia. In fact, it made that person's career almost. Yet that work really, when you experienced it, it had failed. So it was an interesting lesson for me. It made me realise, that the power of the internet, because I think it's quite widely known that a lot of curators now don't visit shows. A lot of buyers buy offline. They don't have that impact of an actual work. That physicality of a work. They actually evaluate it through an online experience. And I think there are quite a few artists who probably operate along the lines to facilitate that. I think with that Golden Monkey project, it was a very physical work, but it did translate because of the community that it was working through. But they use social media a lot, so they take a lot of selfies. They project. My name wasn't attached to a lot of these posts, so it wasn't really from an arts perspective. It was from this social perspective that it was spread around. But it also went through a lot of magazine systems. So I was very conscious of getting some really good images taken, and I'm really glad I did, because those images are then the ones that go through wallpaper or whoever was doing the articles on that work, and it created a further impact. And it's what you remember. It's what you get at the end.
It's probably a statement too that makes you realise the importance of art in the public realm. When we're talking about the fact that we are all behind screens and people's engagement is often online or whatever, then one of the last sort of bastions is actually almost by stealth to have art in the public space, because people will come upon it, even if they don't know it's art sometimes. I mean, it is actually, you know, it could be the true democracy of art, actually, when you start to think about it, because in a way you're opening yourself up to physical engagement and kind of open engagement, and it can be mediated through Instagram and social media and so on, but nonetheless the experience is out there for everyone. So, you know, perhaps that's a powerful message for art in the public realm as well, and perhaps a good point to finish on, unless we have one last question. Yes, we do.
Quick one, just to Lisa, you mentioned earlier on, just explain briefly that you're quite proactive, or you have been quite proactive in placing and approaching people about placing your art.
Well, I sort of see them as, you know, I've got works like, for example, going back to that Chinese experience in Shanghai years ago. You know, it really sits with me. I had this open heart surgery a couple of years ago where I got a transplanted heart, basically. And, you know, the last thing I remember going under was like that fucking piece. I just didn't, you know, it just shits me that it didn't happen. It really does. And it was just that flu, you know. But, sorry, what was your question?
In spite of the heart surgery, yeah, that's right. To use expletives, that's right.
Sorry, what was your question again?
Basically, I think when you started your presentation, you said that unlike public art, you'd been, well, what I picked up, you were quite proactive, which to me kind of meant you would approach places.
I do. I mean, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of people approach me with my work. So to keep it going and to produce the work they want to do, I have to be proactive. I think because I started off my career overseas, my first galleries were in between New York and Europe. I came back to Australia because I had a child, and I came back also because I was part of Primavera, and I just thought, well, maybe I'll start in Australia again. And I'd sort of missed connecting with curators and a connection. So I am very much on my own in Australia. So to get force behind my work, I have to do it myself. Yeah. And, you know, and also it allows me to choose conceptually the places I want the work. Like that 8 foot in with the orangutans in front of it, it creates meaning to that work. So I want it to be there because it fits in with the conceptual nature of the work.
Well, I think we've reached lunchtime, and I would really like you all to join me in thanking Lisa, James, and Ian.